These are the basics of using watercolors. Watercolors are pigments that are ground up and put in different types of binders that can be diluted in water. They come in a lot of different varieties. They come like in cakes, which are the typical forms that you see in Crayola, where it's a circle or a disc or an oval, and it's a hard medium, and then you add water to it. It also comes in liquid forms. It comes in a tube form, and it even comes in colored pencil form. And I'm sure there's others out there, but those are the main ones. Particularly, I like the tube form because it gives you either a wet or a dry. So if you let them dry out, they can become like a cake. But ultimately, if you have them come right out of the tube, they are a paint form. And this way you can do a lot of different variations with it. You can add water to it. You can let it dry and have it the cake form. And it gives you a lot of flexibility. And even if these do dry out, and it takes a really long time for them to dry out if you keep the tubes nice, you can still crack them out and use them as a cake form. So when using watercolors, you are using water, obviously, and it will saturate your paper. So using a normal 80 weight paper like this will oftentimes lead to you saturating your paper, or the paper getting mealy or ripping through, especially if you're using less than an 80 weight paper. Watercolor papers are usually at 140 pounds, and it's kind of like a cardstock as opposed to the regular drawing paper, which is usually about a 60 weight. So this is 140 weight, and the way that the weights are determined is by the ream. So a stack of 500 sheets of 10 by 12 inch paper or 9 by 12 inch paper, they weigh that, and then, or the roll, they weigh. So that's how it's determined, is by the ream, like a big roll or how many 500 sheets would be weighing in a pallet. Or there's different determinations, but ultimately the weight of the paper is going to allow you to saturate it much more than a 60 weight or 80 weight. There's two different types of paper besides that. It's a hot press or a cold press. A hot press gives it a very smooth surface, and the water in the watercolors dry very quickly. And the cold press is more grainy. It's got a texture to it. It doesn't dry as quickly, and there's different purposes for either one depending on the size and what you are using it for. So this is a cold press 140 piece of watercolor paper. So there's three different applications that you can do with watercolor. So I'm going to use a Prussian blue. Prussian blue is a difficult color to work with because it's very grainy, and that also gives you a room to fine-tune your capabilities. So the three different applications are adding water first, adding water to the watercolor paint, and then applying straight pigment. Now, one thing that you need to know about watercolors is it is not like painting. A lot of people say watercolor painting. It's closer to drawing because you can get fine edges with it, and you have to work from what's closest to what's back. If you mix multiple colors or try to layer over watercolors, they're gonna blend together, and it's gonna get real mudded out. So whenever you're using watercolor, think of it like drawing, where you're starting from the closest and working back. So the first way to do it, the first type of application, is to add water to the place that you are going to be adding the pigment to first. Now what you got to come to realize is the water dictates where the pigment can go. If there's no water, it can't move out of there. So you can add water first and get your lines exactly where you want them, and then you can start adding the pigment into it. Like that. The second way is you take a bit of the pigment, move it over to a different spot, and then add water to it and stir it together. This makes sure that you have an even pigmentation. See, in this first one, it kind of pools up in the middle and then it's spread out. This way, you have one even pigment when you're applying it. The third way is to add straight pigment. So you take this, you put it on the paper, and this is going to give you your darkest, but it's also going to allow you to do the best gradients. But considering that you're putting straight pigment on the paper, it's going to be very dark. A way that I like to think about how to use watercolor is thinking about sweeping. So if you have a large floor and there's dust all over the floor, it's very difficult to see where the dust is. But as soon as you take a dustpan and a broom and start sweeping those all together, then you can see it better. So watercolor is the same way, where you can sweep the pigment. So if you're adding water, you can actually take the pigment and push it to different areas. And essentially, you can almost erase areas if you add enough water. Again, why it's closer to drawing than it is painting. But because of this fact, you can get really clean gradations. You can make it go from light to dark very easily and very smoothly, depending on your capabilities. So using watercolor allows you to give elegant gradients, good precision, and very nice pigments. And you can go so far as to make your own pigments, or find your own pigments and make your own watercolor paints. But ultimately, when you're using watercolor, think of it like you are sweeping, that you are brushing the pigment into a certain area where you want, and using these 3 different techniques, adding water first and then adding the pigment to it, mixing it to the side and then adding it to your paper, or putting direct pigment on the paper and then adding water, will give you a lot of different variations of how you can use watercolor. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Do more, do better.